VR hand tracking has problems, from low accuracy to high latency and to the lack of any haptics whatsoever. Hello there and welcome to RealityBreak, your one-stop shop for everything VR and AR related. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about VR hand tracking and how it just hasn't been developed enough to be used instead of controllers. Also, just a heads up, I am going to be saying hand tracking an awful lot in this video. VR hand tracking has been a mainstream feature on standalone headsets since the Quest 1 released with it. And as of this video's release date, if you want the best standalone hand tracking experience, then you're best going with a Meta Quest 2. Just to make sure you know, this video is going to be talking about standalone hand tracking, not finger tracking like you'd have with the Valve Index Knuckles. So, with the recent V56 update to the Quest, hand tracking has improved a fair amount, in terms of accuracy and latency, but there is still issues in those areas, and we'll get onto that later. Other standalone headsets like the Pico 4 do have adequate hand tracking, but its quality is more towards the standard set by the original Quest 1. So for this video, I'll be judging my experience off of my Quest 2, which is updated to V56. Anyway, let's get right into it. Unfortunately, there really is not many VR games that support full hand tracking. But why is that? The only VR headsets which really have hand tracking are standalone headsets, like the Quest 2 and Pico 4, like I mentioned earlier. Of course, the Quest 2 is the best-selling VR headset of all time, selling over 20 million units. So you would have thought a lot of people are interested in hand tracking, but with the retention rate issues I talked about in my last video, the player base generally doesn't play many games outside of the mainstream VR games, like Beat Saber, Pavlov and Blade and Sorcery for example, none of which support hand tracking. So when those players do try a hand tracking game, they may find it interesting and enjoy messing about, but eventually it'll wear off and they'll go back to their normal games that they usually play. At the moment, hand tracking just seems a bit like a gimmick. The technology just isn't there yet to get a satisfying and immersive experience, and because of this, not many games are being made with full hand tracking in mind. Of course, there's exceptions to this, but these games won't really get mainstream recognition like other games, and it's really that simple as to why there just isn't that many hand tracking games. VR developers want to make as much money as possible. Of course, VR is already a very expensive field to enter, as games cost a lot of money, and of course there's also a smaller user base, so it's harder to make that money back. So using controllers and going with a safe bet is what most developers will do. I believe the main issue holding back VR hand tracking is the fact that when you touch something, you don't feel anything in real life, and the hand poses you may be doing in game are not what your hands are actually doing. This is especially prominent when you're in a game and you grab something, as in order to actually do the grabbing gesture, your hand pretty much needs to be closed, but when you grab something, for example a cup, the way that you hold that isn't the way you're actually going to be holding it in real life. This is completely immersion breaking for me and makes it hard for me to even play games with hand tracking, as my brain can just tell something is wrong. Of course, this is bound to happen as hand tracking isn't just magic. There really isn't much that can be done to fix this at the moment. The only real thing you can do is get some real VR gloves, or even make your own. This will give your hands at least some haptic feedback and resistance from items in game. But even the companies that sell these gloves tell you not to buy them unless you're a developer, as they just aren't supported in the very vast majority of games. It takes a lot of time to design full hand controls for games, and for developers, it's just not worth the time or the money developing hand tracking controls for the tiny percentage of people who are even actually going to use them. But before we do get to the next issue, if you are enjoying this video so far, leaving a like and subscribing would really help me out. This is a new channel, so it just needs a little help. Anyway, thanks for your support, and back to the video. Another issue with hand tracking is the latency, and also the accuracy of it. When using hand tracking or even controllers, there is always a noticeable delay between your real hands and your virtual hands moving. You can notice this the most when you're in pass-through mode, as of course you can actually see your real hands. Even those will be a bit delayed because the black and white cameras aren't going to be perfectly real time, but they are pretty close. And the latency is especially bad with hand tracking because you aren't holding controllers, and you feel like you're using your actual hands, but when your hands get left behind for maybe half a second or even less than that, it once again just breaks that immersion, which is what VR is built around. Accuracy is another aspect too. Since headsets like the Quest use inside-out tracking, it can only see what's directly in its view. So if one of your fingers is covered by another part of your hand, the finger will likely glitch out, and not be in the same position that your real finger is. This is also especially annoying when your hands are close together, and one hand may be partially covering the other, which will cause them to once again just glitch out. This also blends in with another issue, which is the loss of tracking. If you put your hands too close to your face, too far down, or too far to the side, tracking will be lost. Even with the recent Quest V56 update, this still happens to me an awful lot. This will often happen when I'm interacting with something with my right hand and I have my left hand just relaxing by my side, and then I see a big red text saying like bad tracking or just something like that. And it's not actually even connected to my hand. It will just say bad tracking right in front of me, just because I don't have my hand right in front of my Quest. And even when you do bring your hand up, it then goes buggy and sort of snaps between your real position and where it was before. Not only is this really annoying, it's also once again just completely immersion breaking. The final issue I'm going to talk about in this video is the fact that hand tracking has no inputs other than your fingers. Usually on controllers, you'd have the normal A, B, X, and Y buttons, along with triggers, grips, and thumbsticks. But with hand tracking, you have none of that. I challenge you to find a controller game which doesn't use any of those buttons, because it just doesn't exist. And if you do find one, chances are it's just a kind of experience where it puts you in, for example, a 3D world. But there's no real functions in the game, so I wouldn't even classify that as a game. Of course, there are ways to work around this for hand tracking, by using gestures, but I personally would so much rather use buttons. Gestures often just don't register, and when they do, they just feel awkward and junky. I also much prefer the fact that when I press a button on my controller, I know it will register, and it will do whatever it is I was trying to do. But with gestures, I may have to do the gesture multiple times for it to actually register. Even if I was to use gestures, games like Blade and Sorcery that use buttons to jump would be extremely weird if I had to use a hand gesture to jump. And that also brings up the question of how would you move in a game with hand tracking. Of course, there will be games that use teleport movement, and I'll talk about one of those later, but if you want full immersion like hand tracking is meant to give you, then I really don't see how you can get a smooth movement by using hand gestures. Hand tracking is in no way perfect, but it's absolutely not bad either. I believe the main problem with hand tracking to just be technology at the moment. It has been getting better though, and you can see this by just comparing things like the Quest 1 to the Quest 2 hand tracking, or even comparing early Quest 2 hand tracking to current Quest 2 hand tracking, and you can definitely notice a difference. I'm interested to see how hand tracking improves with the Quest 3, as it's going to be a crucial part of the tracking process, now that the controllers won't have tracking rings. For this to work properly and not be a downgrade from the Quest 2's tracking, hand tracking needs to be improved a fair amount, and I'm just hoping with the Quest 3's new technology and cameras, this is able to happen. One of the first VR games I ever played was a free game on the Quest 2 called Elixir. This game uses solely hand tracking, and I had a lot of fun in that game, and I think it was a great introduction into VR. My mum even wanted to try it and ended up walking into a wall, so you could definitely say it was immersive. But since playing that game, I just haven't found another game which uses hand tracking as successfully. Even games like Hand Physics Lab, which has been used for a lot of the background footage of this video, just doesn't feel as satisfying. I think why this is because in Elixir you just have to touch things, not actually grab anything. And as I explained earlier, I think grabbing is one of the problems, since you're expecting your hand to look a certain way, and also for your hand to feel a certain way with an object in it. But in Hand Physics Lab, a lot of the gameplay is about grabbing and moving things, and with no haptic feedback, it just does not feel immersive at all. So that is where the problem lies. Of course, things like VR gloves do exist, but are generally expensive, and as I explained earlier, even the creators of the gloves don't recommend buying them as a consumer. You can make your own VR gloves for a lot cheaper, like Lucas VR Tech did, but the VR haptics for those DIY gloves only work in Half-Life Alyx and Boneworks, but the finger tracking will work in all Steam VR games still. So hand tracking is a mixed bag. It has good elements but also bad elements, and honestly the technology just isn't there to make a fully immersive and realistic experience. I'm not a hater of VR or hand tracking whatsoever, I just don't think it's ready to be used by the masses just yet, and I'm sure you can find a way to agree with me here. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comments below, whether you agree with me or even disagree with me. If you did like the video, it would really help me out if you did leave a like and also subscribe. Anyway, hopefully I'll see you next time.